implements initiatives to support economic recovery under the areas of responsibility. Mr. Speaker, as Her Excellency the Governor shared in the speech from the throne last Friday, and I quote, Bermuda's Economic Recovery Plan has 31 priority projects in 7 broad categories: economic diversification, financial markets, infrastructure investment, expanding the residential population, labor market and social development, healthcare reform, and regulatory reform, end quote. Honorable members and the public can remain informed about the progress of Bermuda's Economic Recovery Plan by visiting gov.bm/economic recovery on the government portal. At noon today, Mr. Speaker, this webpage will be updated to provide the current status of all 31 priority initiatives. During Phase 2, these 31 initiatives were independently confirmed as the projects that would best create economic growth in the short to medium term, while meeting the objectives of increasing jobs, diversifying our economy, and enhancing Bermuda's infrastructure for the future. Mr. Speaker, please allow me to share some updates with honorable members in advance of the new webpage that I previously mentioned. Out of the 31 priority projects contained in the Economic Recovery Plan, 9 of the 31 projects are already substantially complete. Other projects, such as upgrading Bermuda's water and wastewater treatment infrastructure, Mr. Speaker, other projects such as upgrading Bermuda's water and waste treatment infrastructure, which incorporates replacing of the plant and equipment at Tynes Bay, have progressed. This is a high priority infrastructure project for the government, given that the existing plan has now exceeded its useful life. As a result, a cross-ministry team is already on an accelerated path to replace key assets and components within the plant in the short term, with the ultimate goal of a fully refurbished and repurposed facility within the next 3 to 4 years. Mr. Speaker, another project that has progressed is, and I quote from the ERP, complete the shoreside facility to process fish caught in Bermuda, end quote. A business plan for Fisheries Development Center is being completed under a steering committee led by the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation, the Department of Environment and Natural Resources, and the Fishermen's Association of Bermuda. The plan will consider how such a facility will benefit the public, create opportunities to show a return on government's investment, and offer additional options and cooperative benefits to participating fishers. The plan will meet the current and future needs of the fishing industry, put fishers at the center to best control their industry, take into consideration economic conditions, as well as consider short to long-term fisheries development factors. The consultation thus far has moved the facilities planning for Marginal Wharf in St. David's to a location in the west end of the island. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda's Economic Recovery Plan states, and I quote, complete work to establish the Uptown Development Authority in Northeast Hamilton, whose mission will be to implement the Northeast Hamilton Development Plan and drive residential development projects in the area, end quote. Mr. Speaker, work on residential developments in Bermuda's economic empowerment zones to increase supply of quality, affordable residential accommodation, driving down rental costs, has also progressed. Guidelines for submitting applications for approved residential schemes within the economic empowerment zones have been developed by the Bermuda Economic Development Corporation, with information for EEZ stakeholders, potential investors, and the general public to be published later this month. Importantly, every approved scheme will create new jobs for Bermudians. Mr. Speaker, one of the 31 priority projects reads as follows, and I quote, use BEDC resources to create an online, small to medium-sized enterprise marketplace that will allow entrepreneurs easy access to sell their goods and services online without having to deal with costly individual setups, large monthly fees, and merchant account complexities, end quote. Mr. Speaker, this initiative is substantially complete, and on November 29th for eMonday, the online marketplace at www.bybermuda.bm will launch. The platform, aptly named By Bermuda, is a local online marketplace where people come together to sell and buy unique Bermudian products and experiences. Mr. Speaker, As the world grapples with the impact of climate change, renewable energy will become an increasingly important part of the global economy. An initiative in Bermuda's Economic Recovery Plan states, and I quote, "Develop an energy regulatory sandbox that will encourage developers of new renewable energy technology to test their products in Bermuda, giving Bermudians access to new technology," end quote. Mr. Speaker, a policy for creating an energy regulatory sandbox has already been produced, and during this session, the Honorable House will consider a bill to facilitate renewable energy technology developers testing their products in Bermuda. Additionally, the government is currently in discussions with a company that will likely be the first applicant for a sandbox license. Mr. Speaker, legislation allowing Bermuda to become a hub for submarine communication cables is now in effect, with a plan for implementation developed by the regulatory authority in consultation with the Ministry of Home Affairs and the Bermuda Business Development Agency. This progress fulfills the objectives stated in the plan to, and I quote, "introduce and establish subsea communications sector in Bermuda, supporting plans to develop a subsea telecommunications protection zone," end quote. The regulatory authority of Bermuda is currently fielding inquiries for companies that are wishing to enter this space. And finally, Mr. Speaker, in the area of healthcare, Bermuda's Economic Recovery Plan states, and I quote, "work with pharmacists, hospitals, and physicians to reduce the cost of medications," end quote. Legislation to pave the way for the establishment of a national drug formulary was passed by the legislature in the last session to achieve this objective. The Bermuda Health Council, using recommendations from the Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, will regulate the prices at which common essential medications, along with associated products and services used in medical treatments, are sold to the public, thereby reducing the largest out-of-pocket healthcare expenditure for a large segment of the community. Mr. Speaker, the coordination of implementation across the 31 diverse initiatives contained in Bermuda's Economic Recovery Plan is being led by a team within the Cabinet Office reporting to the Cabinet Committee on Economic Development. The successful execution of these initiatives will ensure the island is appropriately prepared to recover economically and socially as we move beyond the COVID-19 pandemic. Strong quality assurance, governance, and monitoring processes are essential to this effort. The plan always intended that these functions would be undertaken by resources operating separately from those engaged in the day-to-day running of the government. Mr. Speaker, against this backdrop and with the assistance of Bermuda First, the government engaged with the Big Four consulting firms to determine the best way forward. Based on these collaborative discussions, KPMG was identified as the resource to launch the PMO. The initial contract valued at $144,000 plus expenses was finalized in September and provides a lead consultant with extensive experience in economic recovery. At the conclusion of the KPMG engagements, the consultants will deliver a project management plan complete with resource requirements, key milestones, and timelines and actions enabling required to progress the 31 initiatives which have not yet been complete, and a risk management regime to identify, prioritize, monitor, and where possible, mitigate risks. Upon delivery of the project management plan, further resource decisions concerning the PMO will be determined. Mr. Speaker, as I stated in this Honorable House when we debated the plan in the last session, the PMO will be staffed by government and external resources with specific expertise. This may include a variety of consulting resources from a number of firms on an as-needed basis. The degree of support and expertise will inevitably vary based on the project, with all initiatives subject to milestones and deliverables. As evidenced by the progress made to date, which again, Mr. Speaker, the public can view this afternoon at gov.bm/economic recovery, ownership of each of the 31 initiatives has been assumed by the respective ministry or government agency that has been indicated in the plan. Public officers are focused on finalizing policies and implementing action plans. These steps are central to the project's success, and a mechanism has been put in place to track progress, and the PMO will update the new webpage every month. Mr. Speaker, while the future remains deeply uncertain given public health conditions and the state of the global economy, Bermuda's Economic Recovery Plan provides a blueprint for a successful recovery. Effective implementation is necessary to ensure Bermuda forges a new path to growth, employment, and greater equity. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. The next statement this morning is from the Minister of Finance. Minister?
Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning.
Mr. Speaker, I rise this morning to provide this honorable House with a half-year report on the government's fiscal performance. Mr. Speaker, the COVID-19 pandemic continues to have a material impact on the Bermuda economy and the government's fiscal position. However, significant work has been done by government and the community to combat this virus and adapt to the new normal. As the half-year results highlight, the ongoing work and actions taken to date have had some positive results. The headline numbers for the 2021-2022 national budget are a revenue target of $998.9 million, current expenditure of $1.03 billion, including debt service, capital expenditures of $92.9 million, and a projected deficit of $124.7 million. Mr. Speaker, total revenues for the first half of fiscal 2021-22 are $503.5 million, $40.7 million or 8.8% above September 2020, and broadly in line with the budget. This is mainly due to higher custom duty receipts, along with minor increases in payroll tax collections and stamp duties. Of significance, Mr. Speaker, is the following. Customs duties are up by $25.9 million versus the first half of the 2020-2021 fiscal year and 7% above budget. Payroll taxes were up by $6 million when compared to the same period last year and were on budget. Stamp duties were up by $7.3 million and 27% above budget. Other receipts were 15% below budget, with passenger taxes and transportation infrastructure tax receipts for the period reduced to almost negligible levels. Overall, due to the steady improvement in areas of the economy, the revenue collections in the second quarter of this year are generally tracking on budget. Mr. Speaker, current expenditures, excluding debt service for the period ending September 30, 2021, are $50 million or 11% lower than when compared to the 6 months ended September 2020. Key factors included lower expenditures for the COVID-19 pandemic and unemployment benefits for this fiscal year when compared to 2020-2021. In addition, there were positive impacts from the austerity measures put in place last year to mitigate to some extent the devastating effects that the pandemic was having on the economy. Mr. Speaker, the highlights in relation to expenditures are as follows. Salaries and wages were down by $17.1 million, or 4% below budget, and employer overhead was down by $7.4 million, or 11% below budget. These reductions reflect the critical cost control measures put in place in the summer of 2020, which concluded in August of 2021. Seller-related spend was also reduced by existing vacancies in the public sector. During this period, the government spent $20.7 million in COVID-19 related expenditures, of which $9.2 million was for unemployment and supplemental benefits. We've also spent just over $11.5 million for other COVID-related matters to keep Bermuda safe and secure. The overall spend in this regard, although lower than the corresponding period in 2020-2021, has already exceeded the total estimated funding for the whole of this fiscal year. Costs incurred include the following: COVID-19 testing, contract tracing, vaccine administration, call center operation, and travel authorization management, $7.8 million. Molecular diagnostic lab operations, $2 million. And spend related to the quarantine mandate of $1.7 million. Also during this period, the government has incurred additional expenditures of $8.6 million, which relate to significant government guarantee commitments made under the previous administration. This includes $7.6 million expenditure for the first quarter of the airport revenue guarantee and $1 million in consultancy costs for Morgan's Point, Caroline Bay. These expenditures are anticipated to increase during the remainder of the 2021-22 fiscal year and to have a further negative impact on the government's fiscal position. Overall, notwithstanding the COVID-19 impact and the additional revenues, additional guarantee-related expenditures, current expenditures, excluding debt service, are presently in line with the original annual estimate of $903 million at $456.7 million for the half year. This highlights that the prudent and considered measures put in place in 2020, which have been continually monitored for effectiveness, have played a positive role in protecting the economy from further devastating damage. It is recognized that, in certain instances, expenditures are not made evenly over the year, and therefore may distort actuals when compared to budget. Further, with the expectation of continuing increases in COVID-related expenditure and certain other necessary costs, we continue to carefully evaluate the fiscal position and will, as necessary, take steps to limit expenditure where possible. Interest expenses and related facility fees are tracking in line with 2020 performance, notwithstanding the fact the government undertook additional borrowing last summer. Additional capital of $1.35 billion, which was raised in August of 2020, was able to be financed at historically lower rates than existing debt. Mr. Speaker, I would also highlight that all of the government's capital raise of $1.35 billion was to provide funding for the government and its anticipated economic recovery over the next 2 to 3 years. Mr. Speaker, excluding debt service, the government recorded a $21.1 million current account surplus for the first 6 months of the year, compared to a $71.4 million deficit in 2020. The all-inclusive deficit was $43.3 million compared to a projected deficit of $135.8 million in 2020. The deficit was financed by the above referenced capital raise. Mr. Speaker, gross debt at the end of September 2021 remains at $3.35 billion, and net of sinking fund balances, the debt was $3.05 billion. Mr. Speaker, I would like to advise that the Ministry of Finance is currently finalizing its detailed assessment of the 2021-22 mid-year performance. This mid-year review will provide the revised estimates of revenue and expenditure for fiscal 2021-22, along with economic data and actions required to remain within the 2021-2022 budget deficit of $124.7 million. I intend to report back to the House later in this session the updated 2021-22 revised estimates of revenue and expenditure. Mr. Speaker, it is imperative that the budget deficit target for fiscal 2021-2022 is not exceeded, given the current high level of public debt. The Ministry of Finance regards any breach of the deficit target to be a serious issue, as continuous increases in the deficit and debt levels will likely negatively impact Bermuda's credit rating and the cost of refinancing government debt in the future. In this regard, we would again note that over the next 24 months, nearly $1 billion of debt will have to be refinanced. Therefore, it is important that we continue to ensure that fiscal matters are managed in a prudent and considered way, and that we adhere to our commitments to balancing the budget by 2023-24. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I must remind all that we should continue to work together to successfully progress our lives beyond this pandemic and to ensure that there is a sustained and shared economic recovery for our country. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Members, the next statement this morning is in the name of the Minister of Transport. Minister?
Yes, good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Good morning.
Mr. Speaker, on the 23rd of July, 2021.
Just a reminder to turn your video on, Minister.
Oh, I thought I had, sorry. Can you see me now?
You can see you now.
All right. Thank you. Mr. Speaker, on the 23rd of July, 2021, I advise this Honorable House of the payments made at the outset in the project agreement between Skyport and the Bermuda Airport Authority. I wish to provide the House with an update on the latest MRG payment made to Skyport this month. Mr. Speaker, on the 10th of October, Skyport provided the Airport Authority with a formal notice of the shortfall between the actual airport regulated revenue collected for the period from the 1st of July to the 30th of September 2021 and the guaranteed minimum regulated revenue for the same period, which was an amount totaling $8,451,053.51. Mr. Speaker, earlier this year, I advised the House that the project agreement contains a predetermined payment schedule of the MRG amounts for each calendar quarter of the 30-year contract. The government continues to honor its obligations in this regard, including making the latest MRG payment of $8,451,053.51 to Skyport. Mr. Speaker, to date, we have made 5 MRG payments to Skyport, totaling $40,964,566.74. Although we are trending in the right direction, meaning each consecutive payment has been lower than the previous one, even with that increased air routes and passenger traffic resulting from our new air service development strategy, we anticipate that the MRG payments in 2022 could be over $10 million. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister, for a nice brief statement this morning. The next statement this morning is in the name of the Minister for Social Development and Seniors. Minister, would you like to present your statement at this time?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Good morning to
Go right
you.
ahead.
Mr. Speaker, I rise today to relay the issues related to social development and social protections in a protracted crisis, which were presented and discussed by the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean at the 4th session of the Regional Conference on Social Development in Latin America and the Caribbean, held from October 26 to October 28, 2021. Mr. Speaker, according to the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, Bermuda has been living a protracted crisis since March 2020, whereby our population has been facing heightened risk of death, disease, and breakdown of livelihoods over an elongated period of time. The COVID-19 pandemic and damage spurring from our annual hurricane seasons require interventions that are framed as holistic approaches to development. Mr. Speaker, the World Health Organization has estimated an additional 38 billion COVID-19 vaccines are needed to reach the aspirational 70% population coverage rate worldwide. Bermuda was commended, noting to be one of the 5 countries within Latin America and the Caribbean region who will meet the global COVID-19 vaccination coverage goal by the end of 2021. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda is amongst the regions that have suffered the most economic and unemployment regression worldwide, and estimates show that only 5% of our neighboring countries will recover. The 2021 edition of the Bermuda Job Market Employment Brief highlighted that between 2019 and 2020, we have seen a total jobs filled decrease by 5.7%, which represents the largest year-over-year decrease since 2012. The social impacts of disasters are compounded by economic losses. There is a growing consensus that inequality is an enemy of productivity, learning, and innovation. For Bermuda's vulnerable population, unequal access to health and social protection services has meant a hard choice between livelihood and exposure to contagion. Mr. Speaker, through cross-jurisdictional analysis conducted by the United Nations and regional governments, it has been determined that women and young people have been the most impacted demographic by COVID-19 pandemic and recent natural disasters. It is estimated by the end of 2021, 79% of population within the Latin American Caribbean will earn revenues below the national and regional poverty lines. This is an increase of 22 million people from 2020. Recent data from the Department of Statistics reveals that in 1 year from 2019 to 2020, that the disparity gaps between our demographics have widened. In 2019, the pay difference between men and women was estimated to be 8.2%, and this rose to 9.7% in 2020, further exacerbating gender-related issues. On racial terms in 2019, the pay difference between blacks and whites was calculated to be 36.3%. This has risen to 39.1% in 2020, deepening Bermuda's wealth distribution gap. Mr. Speaker, echoing the sentiments from the fourth session of the Regional Conference on Social Development in Latin America and the Caribbean, recovery from a social development crisis requires a government to build forward better with a leave no one behind approach, with equality and sustainability. Transformational approaches should focus on guaranteeing income, access, expenditure reduction, and cash transfers. Mr. Speaker, as we have been impacted in one way or another by the COVID-19 pandemic worldwide, there is an urgent call by the international community to encourage governments to take a mainstream approach to mental health in incorporating support systems into social protection frameworks. Mr. Speaker, as we move to a post-pandemic state and attempt to mitigate the effects of climate change, governments within Latin America and the Caribbean region have recognized the need for creating vulnerability index as a replacement for the gross domestic product as an indicator of development, inequality, and stability of social protections. Mr. Speaker, the public should be made aware that the UN Women of the Caribbean extended an invitation to have an initial dialogue with government of Bermuda. The aim of that meeting was to discuss strengthening the social frameworks that will build capacity, along with innovative financing opportunities to enhance Bermuda's social resilience. Mr. Speaker, I will provide updates as these discussions progress. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Members, the next statement this morning is in the name of the Minister of Health. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker and honorable members, in this year's throne speech, the government of Bermuda has reaffirmed its intention to implement universal health coverage for all residents. Our vision for healthcare seeks to ensure that all people have equitable access to needed informative, preventative, curative, rehabilitative, and palliative essential health services of sufficient quality to be effective while also ensuring that people do not suffer financial hardship when paying for these services and critical medicines. Mr. Speaker, Bermuda is fortunate in that we have a health system that is well developed and well supported by dedicated professionals. However, the overall affordability and sustainability of our health system is deeply concerning for this government. Bermuda has one of the highest per capita health expenditures globally, but our population health outcomes do not reflect this. Continuing with the status quo in the hope that this situation resolves itself is not a reasonable option. Mr. Speaker, change is required, and the journey is indeed complex and one which we will travel together for several years as we seek to ensure better health outcomes, particularly of chronic disease management, essential health services that residents can be confident that they can afford when they need them, and the elimination of waste and duplication when it occurs. Having committed to universal health coverage, the Ministry of Health was tasked with developing the way forward. To do so, the ministry brought together a core group of stakeholders from across our health system to serve as the Universal Health Coverage, or UHC, Steering Committee to develop the roadmap for strengthening Bermuda's healthcare. The UHC Steering Committee is led by the Ministry of Health and comprises representatives of Bermuda First, the Bermuda Medical Doctors Association, the Bermuda Health Council, the Department of Health, the Bermuda Hospitals Board, the Health Insurance Department, the Ministry of Finance, and the patient representative, and is supported by work by KPMG. In this process, Mr. Speaker, the steering committee took note of healthcare systems in other jurisdictions, large and small, who have already taken their first steps on this journey. It is clear that there are many paths to reach universal health coverage, and the UHC is very much advocated by the United Nations and the World Health Organization. But the approach taken here on our island must be Bermuda-centric. Mr. Speaker, we do know that the goal of achieving universal health coverage will be achieved in stages, and these stages will take place over a number of years. It is our commitment to the people of Bermuda that we will keep them fully informed of the progress. As part of developing the roadmap, Mr. Speaker, the UHC Steering Committee examined the current health system and identified a number of actions to prioritize for its strengthening. And these can be grouped into the following three areas. 1, stewardship and governance. 2, healthcare service delivery. And 3, health system value and finance. Taking in each in its turn, Mr. Speaker, stewardship and governance. This is the foundational framework for the health system. This is where vision and strategy are set. Population health needs are understood, transparent responsibility and accountability are established, and organizational and legal structures are implemented. For example, Mr. Speaker, with respect to responsibility and accountability, identified actions include setting standard metrics for measuring and monitoring systems and population health performance, and for public reporting of the results. How does Bermuda measure up against other jurisdictions in terms of our population's health? How does Bermuda measure up in terms of best practices? Secondly, Mr. Speaker, strengthening healthcare service delivery, and this involves ensuring all residents have equitable access to essential healthcare that is integrated in an efficient manner and which produces good patient experiences and health outcomes. Identified actions in this area include determining what are the essential healthcare services, what approach do we take to delivery of these care services, how do we take advantage of advancements in information systems to better manage patient care. Concerning the third work area, Mr. Speaker, health system value and financing. This is a very challenging aspect for Bermuda. As stated previously, our health expenditure is high and does not match our health outcomes. However, before making abrupt changes to achieve a sustained health system, it is critical to fully understand current and future costs, both at a system and individual patient level. Therefore, identified actions include, but are not limited to, confirming the current cost of care and how these costs are distributed, modeling future costs, including the do-nothing option, identifying where savings exist across the health system, and evaluating modern purchases and procurement mechanisms so that we know how the essential benefits can be most effectively purchased. These steps and more constitute very necessary and responsible due diligence. Mr. Speaker, while the pandemic delayed work on plans for universal health coverage, as the ministry, hospital, health council, physicians, and allied professionals across Bermuda joined in the fight against COVID-19, this delay created space and time for the ministry, working closely with the UHC Steering Committee, to develop a refreshed approach to health system change. And as a result, the many actions identified as necessary to strengthen Bermuda's health system are based on and framed by a patient-focused approach that puts patients' experiences and outcomes at the center of the work on universal health coverage. Mr. Speaker, year one of the initial 3-year roadmap for universal health coverage is foundational in nature. 3 of the year one areas of work are mentioned in the throne speech, namely digital health strategy, and that involves establishing a national strategy for digital health care and data that leverages health information systems to harness improvements and efficiencies for patients, healthcare providers, and health system payers. Integrated patient pathway for essential care. This involves implementing a patient pathway approach, which focuses on a patient's journey or pathway through the healthcare system. And it allows us to examine the fragmented components of healthcare and the costs involved at each point that care is delivered. A pathway can be a particular patient group, such as maternal child care, or a disease such as a kidney disease or heart disease. And by following a pathway from start to finish, we can better see opportunities to improve patient experiences and outcomes, as well as address any duplicative, wasteful use of resources. And commence merging of administration of government healthcare plans. Mr. Speaker, the review and implement a merger of the administration functions of the government plans is what this refers to. A portion of this work was undertaken when the health insurance plan and the future care were consolidated under the Health Insurance Department. This administrative merger would represent the completion of this process and involves GEHI and funds controlled by financial assistance and other patient care subsidies. The other areas of work in year one, Mr. Speaker, include setting up the organizational structure for stewardship and governance, and this includes the new working groups for collaboration with stakeholders, determining the baselines required, for example, for our health needs and for the metrics to measure our performance, and establish the economic case for strengthening our health system. Mr. Speaker, virtually important for the work on universal health coverage is the engagement of and collaboration with the broad group of stakeholders who form part of Bermuda's health system. We have a direction of travel, but there are many questions to answer and decisions to make that will need broader input than is represented solely on the UHC Steering Committee or the ministry itself. In the coming weeks, the ministry will be meeting with the executive and memberships of those steering committee, as well as the private insurers, Bermuda Medical Council and Nursing and Midwifery Council, the Bermuda Chamber of Commerce, the Bermuda Employers Council, ABIR, ABIC, and our union leaders and others. The purpose is to share the roadmap for achieving universal health coverage and the work done so far, and most importantly, the work still to be done. We know their insight and feedback will be invaluable as we improve healthcare access, experience, and outcomes for all who live here. Mr. Speaker, let us not lose sight of our personal responsibility for our own health. With or without universal health coverage, the Ministry of Health seeks to empower the community to lead healthy lifestyles. To do this, the Department of Health provides information and tools for individuals to take charge of their health. Lifestyle is the cause of many common chronic diseases, and that means it can also be part of treating and even reversing them. Through the Department of Health's HEAL program, that stands for Healthy Eating and Active Living, we strongly encourage the people of Bermuda to participate in one or more of the following initiatives. Complete Health Improvement Program, or CHIP, is one of the world's most scientifically proven intensive lifestyle intervention solutions designed to help support and facilitate the prevention, treatment, and reversal of chronic diseases. Facilitated over 12 to 18 sessions is a group setting. CHIP puts you on the fast track to better health by guiding you towards habits that will help you thrive. Grow, Eat, Save is a free 8-week gardening initiative where attendees learn the basics of starting their own garden from gardening experts and have the opportunity to work in teams on a plot provided by the Parks Department to implement the skills that they have learned in class. Attendees learn to be sustainable in providing some food to their families during these difficult times. And the Hearts Initiative is a pilot program due to be launched in January to implement evidence-based hypertension and diabetes protocols to improve the management of cardiovascular health in primary care. Mr. Speaker, these are only a few examples of the wellness initiatives available through the Department of Health. We fully recognize the fundamental role of prevention in contributing to healthy outcomes and a sustainable health system. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I would like to take this opportunity to thank the UHC Steering Committee for their hard work to date. This is the beginning of a multi-year journey with challenges and complexities in front of us, and I very much appreciate their contributions, which have put Bermuda on a realistic path to achieving universal health coverage. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. Members, the next statement this morning is that from the Minister of Immigration and Labor. Minister?
Good morning, Mr. Speaker.
Morning.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in this honorable house today that effective December 1st, 2021, the amendments to the Bermuda Immigration and Protection Act 1956, which allow for long-term residents to become permanent resident certificate holders in Bermuda, will be brought into force. The Department of Immigration will begin accepting applications for permanent resident certificates under the provisions of this legislation effective January 1, 2022. 2022. Mr. Speaker, the legislative amendments are in alignment with the immigration reform strategic priority to achieve a simplified, fair, and modern immigration legislative framework. To that end, the amendments will keep families together who may be separated and create a fair avenue to permanent residency in Bermuda, enable long-term residents to fully participate economically, and support Bermuda in the retention of its residential population. It also represents a key initiative in support of Bermuda's economic recovery plan. Mr. Speaker, the amendments to the Bermuda Immigration and Protection Act 1956 are as follows. Section 31ZA expands the eligibility criteria for the granting of permanent residence certificates to include any person who has been ordinarily resident in Bermuda for 20 years or more. Section 31ZB expands the eligibility criteria for the granting of a permanent residence certificate to include a non-Bermudian parent of a child with Bermuda status who has been ordinarily resident in Bermuda for 15 years or more. And Section 31B expands upon current provisions that allow the granting of permanent residence certificates to children born to second generation permanent residence certificate holders who have been ordinarily resident in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, the application fee for a permanent residence certificate under 31A of the Act has remained at $50,000, along with the application fee for the children and spouses of permanent residence certificate holders under 31B of the Act, which is $3,150. The new fees are introduced as follows. $10,000 for a long-term resident who is ordinarily resident for 20 plus years under Section 31Z. $10,000 for a long-term resident who is a parent of a child that possesses Bermuda status under 31ZB. Mr. Speaker, in order to apply for a permanent residence certificate, individuals must take the following steps. Visit the Department of Immigration website, complete the permanent residence certificate application form online, make an online payment, submit the application and all required documents in the immigration drop box located on the first floor of the Government Administration Building with a copy of your online payment confirmation. Mr. Speaker, it should be noted that in alignment with government's strategic priority, leverage technology to improve operations, which will lead to greater levels of efficiency, process consistency, and sustainability. The Department of Immigration will transition to a digital application process, which will commence next year. Mr. Speaker, these amendments create a clear, transparent, and streamlined process to secure some form of permanency for long-term residents. The policy proposal seeks to provide a sustainable solution for long-term residents living in Bermuda to gain a permanent residence certificate. Although there is still much to be done to reform our immigration system, we are that much closer, as this accomplishment fulfills our platform promise to provide a framework for persons to obtain permanent residency in Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, as the Minister responsible for immigration, I would like to take this opportunity to thank all within the ministry who has helped to make these amendments a reality. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The members, the next statement, final statement this morning is in the name of the Acting Minister for Works and Engineering. Minister, would you like to present your statement?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Go right ahead.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning to Bermuda. Mr. Speaker, I rise to provide this honorable House with an update on the St. George's Marina Development Project. Mr. Speaker, last week, honorable members heard mentioned in the speech from the throne that the legislature will consider in due course a strategic plan for the town of St. George's, which will include consultation with all relevant stakeholders, and will represent the best means by which to raise the fortunes of the old town in the wake of the renewal opportunity presented by New St. Regis Hotel and the St. George's Club that is currently undergoing renovations. A key component of this revitalization in the town of St. George's for the residents and visitors alike will be the development of a new marina on Orleans Island. This new development is being undertaken by private developers, St. George's Marina Development Limited. in conjunction with the Corporation of St. George's in a private-public partnership. With the upgrades to the Ordnance Islands dock, Ordnance Islands will now have the ability to berth yachts up to the super yacht class, as well as cruise ships. The arrangement will see the corporation leasing the land to the developer for 21 years less a day, and a sharing of the gross proceeds of the marina revenue. The new marina will have the following: improved and designated docks area for visiting yachts, newly replaced and repaired dock on the south side of Ordnance Island.
Mr. Speaker, we have no idea of the ministerial statement that's being read right now.
It's not on the order paper.
It's not on the order paper.
There was an amended order paper that was supposed to have gone out, this morning.
It is not
And-
received.
Okay, well, let me say, we did have all sorts of technical issues here this morning, and that could be part of the reason, but the item should have been included on the order paper. So I'll take
The statement.
I'll take responsibility for it not being there because of our technical problems this morning. However, the statement should be up on the SharePoint.
It's not.
It's not. It's not, Mr. Speaker.
Okay, let me, waiting for the technical. Is it showing up? We just worked it out. Again, that was part of the hiccup.
Mr. Speaker.
You should see it there now.
Yes.
It's there now. Okay. Thank you. Continue on, Minister.
As I mentioned, Mr. Speaker, improved and designated dock areas for visiting yachts, a newly replaced and repaired dock on the south side of Ordnance Island, 650 linear feet of visiting dock for smaller yachts, 10 sterns to berth super yachts with mooring systems, marina reception, lounge, food and beverage, and internet cafe, duty-free fuel dock, and the installation of sewage pumping services. Mr. Speaker, in order for these infrastructure developments to fully function, and the wharf at Ordnance Islands, constructed many decades ago, needs to be replaced. With the assistance of the Department of Works and Engineering, Corporation of St. George's engaged the services of structural engineer Bruno Limited, who performed an initial inspection of the wharf March 2021. Bruno estimated that the refurbishment cost at $2.2 million. However, after a more detailed survey was performed, it was determined that the piles were so deteriorated that they could not be reused as ordinarily put, with the replacement cost estimated now to be $2.7 million. Mr. Speaker, to ensure this project comes to fruition, the Ministry of Public Works has committed $1.5 million the refurbishment of the wharf for this fiscal year. Additional funding will be sourced from the Corporation of St. George's, who have the ability to make up the difference using the UNESCO World Heritage Fund. This to be used to develop and promote the World Heritage Site. The funding secured, the replacement of the wharf is now poised to take place. Mr. Speaker, work on the new wharf is slated to take place in February of 2022, following the tendering process. The work is estimated to take some 4 months to complete, with the wharf ready in May of 2020, just in time for our tourist and summer season as far as yachts coming in. In addition, the wharf upgrades, the Marina Infrastructure undertaken by St. George's Marina Development Limited, is currently underway and is slated to be completed in conjunction with the wharf. These works include internal renovations of the former terminal building on Ordnance Island and a welcome center complete with shower facilities and a laundry facility. The space will be redesigned for an improved decor and to create an outdoor lounge area. Mr. Speaker, with the opening of the St. Regis Hotel in May, the planned reopening of the St. George's Club in the second quarter of 2022, and the new marina scheduled for completion in May of next year, these developments are expected to provide a further economic boost into our historic town and be of great benefit to all Bermudans and residents alike. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. That brings us to a close for the statements this morning. The next item on the order paper are reports from committees. There are none. We now go to the question period. It's 11:02. And questions this morning. We have no written questions. So the questions this morning will come from the statements that have been presented today. The first is statement this morning by the Premier. Premier, you have a question, and that question is from the opposition leader. Opposition leader, would you like to put your question now?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Premier, for your statement. I have just a few general questions. Can the Premier provide the total amount budgeted for the delivery of the 31 items shown on the Bermuda Economic Recovery Plan?
Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I will not be able to provide that figure. Certainly, with matters such as Times Bay, et cetera, and a number of things in there that they would not be able to provide that figure. But what we can say is that there was $1 million in this budget year for the support of the project management activities under the line item of implementation plan.
Yep. Supplementary?
No, I'll move to second question.
Second question, right ahead.
Of the items highlighted in this report, can the Premier provide an estimate of the number of new jobs that will be created for each of the items and initiatives showcased in this statement?
Premier?
Mr. Speaker, I cannot give that honorable member the figure. What I can say is that the economic recovery plan itself, in the revisions of the economic recovery plan, the 31 priority items were designed or chosen out of the multitude of items that were proposed from both public sources and also the Economic Advisory Committee in regards to the ones that would have the most impact based upon jobs, also on the ease of implementation and the impact to the government's budget. But the view is that if successful implementation of the economic recovery plan, as is stated inside of the public plan, which was tabled in this House in March and subsequently debated, notes a return and an increased return of GDP growth, which will better public finances and result in increased jobs in the economy.
Supplementary?
Supplementary. So based on what you just said, do you have a projection for the GDP growth as a result of these initiatives?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That information is in the public domain, and it was included as part of the plan that was tabled in this Honorable House of Assembly in March and debated in May.
For the benefit of the public, can he repeat it?
Say again?
For the benefit of the public, can he repeat the GDP growth?
Once it's in the public domain, it's not necessarily required to have to respond to it by the standing orders.
Okay, my next supplemental question.
Yes, go to the second question.
In this statement, the Premier indicated that KPMG had an initial contract valued at $144,000. What other contracts does the Premier expect to have with KPMG and the other big four accounting firms?
Premier?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As was stated inside of the statement following the conclusion of the contractual work, which is being done by KPMG, I think the statement points to any further resource needs that will be identified after the first stage will be done. So I cannot necessarily answer the opposition leader's question outside of that the statement speaks to what the next steps will be.
Thank you. That's all I have.
No more questions? Thank you.
No, I don't.
Premier, you also have a question from the opposition whip. Opposition whip?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm just waiting for the video up there. And thank you, Honorable Minister. Honorable Premier. Mr. Speaker, in his statement, it reads on page 4 of 5 that the consultants will deliver a project management plan complete with resource requirements, key milestones, and timelines, actions, and enablers required to progress the 31 initiatives. My question is, was there a project plan already in use when government announced the ERP 8 months ago?
I'm not entirely certain of what the honorable member is trying to get at, Mr. Speaker, but I'll try to answer the question in the best way possible. As the statement speaks to it, there is the fact that there are multiple projects, and prior to even the tabling of this bill, there were initiatives that were contained inside of the Economic Recovery Plan, which was under development as early as July 2020, as stated inside of the statement with the work that was done by the Economic Advisory Committee appointed by the Minister of Finance and others. So there was certainly work that was done. There were individual implementation plans that would certainly be happening for individual projects. What we're speaking about is that recognizing that there are 31 priority initiatives, recognizing the level, scale, and scope of this. It is an issue from the project management office's perspective of making sure that all of the implementations across all the various plans are coordinated. And so the resources can be handled effectively. And so we can understand which matters may need additional resources, which matters may need less resources to progress. But I think it's important to note that, as I said inside of the statement, 9 of the 31 initiatives are substantially complete. So that means that there was implementation plans and work that was taking place prior to this. But now we recognize that those are things which may have been easier to implement, and there are things which may be more difficult, certainly, and recognizing that various sectors of the government are engaged in day-to-day work and activities, but understanding how vital the Economic Recovery Plan is, or the successful execution of the Economic Recovery Plan, we want to make sure that we are properly resourced in the areas which are necessary to drive those things forward.
Supplementary question?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, and thank Honorable Minister, Honorable Premier. So it would be fair to say then that there was no centralized project management plan at that time.
If I may, Mr. Speaker, that would absolutely be correct. The fact is that individual plans certainly had their things, but we're speaking on a project management PMO perspective. And if we go and refer back to the public plan, which was tabled in the House in March and debated in May, it speaks to all of these particular issues about the individual plan and coming up with a broader framework to make sure that all the areas of government can effectively deliver all of the 31 initiatives.
Supplementary? I mean, what's your second supplementary or a new question?
New question, Mr. Speaker.
New question, go ahead.
As it relates to the Honorable Premier's statement on page 2, which reads, a business plan for a fisheries development center is being completed under a steering committee, and that the plan will consider how such a facility will benefit the public. Mr. Speaker, my question is, given that the ERP on page 18 says that that they are currently completing the construction of a shoreside fish processing plant, in other words, it sounds like there's one already in development. My question is, how much of that shoreside plant has already been constructed at Marginal Wharf?
No.
Response?
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. It seems the opposition leader has answered the question of the opposition. But yes, your mic is still on, opposition leader, so everyone heard the response. But as was given in the statement, Mr. Speaker, the initial plans, as been previously announced, were for the shoreside facility to be placed in Marginal Wharf. However, what we want to ensure is that this plan is successful, and so with consultation taking place with the persons which are noted between the Department of Environmental and Natural Resources, Bermuda Economic Development, and the Fishermen's Association of Bermuda, it has been determined that it is a better siting for the project to take place in the West End. And so that is where the development and work is moving. Money has been budgeted for this project to continue to proceed. We want to ensure this project proceeds, but what we want to make sure to do is that it works for the fishermen. We recognize the plan which was laid out on the shoreside facility from way back in 2005 has spoken about this, but what we are determined to do is to make this a reality. There is money to be earned from fishing inside of our waters. There is additional stuff of which we can do to boost economic output domestically, and that is what this is intended to do. But we want to make sure that we get it right, and the consultation efforts are ongoing, and we want to complete the consultation efforts, identify the new site, which is now going to be in the western part of the island, so that we can proceed with the construction and implementation of this very important project.
Mr. Speaker, I think your mic.
Supplementary?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Would the Honorable Minister please inform the Honorable House why?
You want to do a supplementary or a new question?
Supplementary.
Okay. Go ahead.
Why was construction started at Marginal Wharf with the plan incomplete at the time of notifying the public in March?
There has been no construction commenced at Marginal Wharf. I thought I made that clear in my previous answer.
Thank you. Another question, or you finished?
That's it. That's
Thank
it.
you,
Thank you,
Mr.
Mr. Speaker.
Opposition Whip. Premier, that's the last question for you this morning. We'll move on to the next statement. The next statement from the Minister of Finance. Minister of Finance, you have a question this morning from the opposition leader. Okay, opposition leader, what's your question? Opposition leader, is your mic on?
I blew it last time, so I turned it off.
Okay, we can hear. We hear you now. You can present your
Thank
question.
you. On the second page, the minister indicated that there was a variance of $25.9 million, a positive variance of $25.9 million on customs duties and stamp duties variance of 7.3. Can the minister give us a breakdown of the variances, i.e. the source of customs duty, like retail, construction, anything that can provide more meat on the source of this additional stamp duty and additional customs duties?
Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I don't have that information readily available, but I certainly can undertake to get it. But I would provide just some context. Honorable members would know that between April 1 of last year and September the 30th, we had a full island lockdown and a suspension of air travel in and out of Bermuda. Between April 1 and September 30th of this year, we did not have a similar occurrence. And so the amount of people traveling would obviously be higher during this year than it was last year. And correspondingly, you would see the potential for more customs revenue. But we will undertake to get specific line items around what goods were brought in by quantum, so we can kind of identify and share with the opposition leader the details around what's giving rise to the variance.
And the same thing applies to the.
Would that be a supplementary question?
No, I asked a double question about the stamp duties as well.
Okay.
We can undertake to get that information as well.
Thank you. Supplementary or new question?
Yes, second question. Page 4. It reads, this includes $7.7 million expenditure for the first quarter of the April revenue guarantee and $1 million in consultancy costs to Morgan's Point in Caroline Bay. Can the minister identify the consultants who enjoyed this $1 million in consultancy fees? And
the consultants would include, and I can't give an exhaustive list from top of mind, but they would include the Joint Provision of Liquidators, or EY, the Joint Provision of Liquidators lawyers, which are MJM, actually Marshall, Deal and Myers. They would include the government's lawyer, Trott and Duncan. They would include the Queen's Counsel that have been retained by both the lawyers for the government and the lawyers for the JPLs. They would include Rose Investment, who are financial advisors to the government of Bermuda. They would include Alvarez and Marcel, who are also restructuring experts who are providing advice to the government of Bermuda.
Supplementary?
No, thank you very much. That's it for me.
That's it? Okay. Minister, you also have a question from MP Pearman. MP Pearman, would you like to put your question?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Honorable Minister of Finance, for your most informative statement this morning. I just have one question, and that's in relation to the paragraph at the bottom of page 5 of your statement, where you state that it's imperative that the budget deficit target for fiscal 2021-22 is not exceeded, and you regard any breach of the deficit target to be a serious issue. And you go on to make reference to the $1 billion of debt that needs to be refinanced. In view of the serious issue in that refinance, can the minister share with us any thoughts on the need or otherwise to raise the debt ceiling in the coming period?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Colleagues will remember in August of last year when I announced the successful completion of the debt transaction last August, that I did mention that we had gone to market to secure funding, one, to refinance existing bonds, but also to raise additional capital to fund the government during the inevitable economic fallout occurring from the pandemic. At that time, I mentioned that we had sought to achieve a financing which provided us with funds to fund the government for 2 to 3 years of deficits while the economy recovered. I do not foresee at this point any need to raise the debt ceiling. In actual fact, the plan that we have laid out anticipates that there will be no need to raise the debt ceiling if we are able to live within our means with respect to the deficit projections that we've set out. The plan called for a deficit of $124.7 this year, a number of approximately $41 million deficit next year, and in the following year, a slight surplus. So we are operating towards those plans, taking the required measures to ensure that we set priorities and fund them accordingly so that we can meet our targets.
Another question or supplementary?
A supplementary.
Supplementary?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Minister. Minister, on the $1 billion debt refinance in the next 24 months, are you able to share with the House at this stage how that is progressing, whether you're optimistic, pessimistic, etc.?
We are 1 year out. We're 1 year out from the first set of maturities. So, in actual fact, over the course of the next 24 months, there will be 4 sets of debt, 4 sets of bonds that will be maturing. About 400 and change in December of actually $170 million in December of 2022, and then a further $300+ million in early 2023, and then again in late 2023, and then early 2024. And so I look at these refinancings in tranches of $500 million buckets, slightly less than $500 million. We're a year out, and my current thinking is that we would try to approach the markets next November in advance of the maturities that would happen in December of 2022. And at that point, we would seek to refinance the maturing debt in December, as well as the debt that's coming due in January or February of 2023. My team has certainly started to engage underwriters to get their views on what the best strategies are going to be. We are somewhat early in this exercise, but I don't mind being early to this, get the best thinking. But we will be, to some degree, subject to the interest rate environment that exists at that point in time. When we accessed the market last August, we were fortunate enough to kind of tap into investor demand, and rates were there at historic lows, probably at the trough of the interest rate cycle. Over the course of the last 15 months, rates have been increasing by about 100 basis points. And so we will see what happens in the market over the course of the coming months and be able to respond at a time appropriately, in as much as we see that rates are going to move far ahead of where we think they should be when we enter the market to refinance next November. Having said that, all I'm saying is that The plan now is for November, but market opportunities may dictate us going a bit sooner. And so we're preparing ourselves now for the eventuality of having to tap into the market next year.
Thank you. New question or second supplementary?
No, that's fine. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Minister of Finance.
Thank you. Minister of Finance, there are no further questions for you. Minister of Transport, we have questions for you this morning. The first question this morning is from MP Weeks. MP Weeks, would you like to put your question?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, good morning.
Good morning.
Yes, and the first question I have for the Minister of Transport is.
Can I remind you to put your mic, your video on, please? Thank
Yes,
you.
it's on.
Okay, we see you now.
Oh, you see me now? Okay. So my question for the Minister of Transport is that inquiring minds want to know, Mr. Minister, with all this money that has been transferred to Skyport, how does that affect the Ministry of Transport and or in actual fact the average Bermudian?
Understand?
Minister?
That's a good question. And I think that the best way for me to answer would be by just outlining what the ministry could have done with those funds. The money that is being transferred to Skyport or Acorn's New York-based escrow account by the ministry could have subsidized 2 flights per week from Boston, 2 flights per week from Baltimore, and that would have been able to allow for consistent connectivity for Bermudians needing off-island medical care. We could have subsidized that for the whole year. We could have then done 3 times per week service to Miami, which would have helped the Bermuda Postal Service expedite and streamline their delivery of transportation of overseas mails and packages. That could have also been done for the year. We could have then also subsidized twice a week service to and from the Caribbean, which would have put us into a new market with new revenue streams, and which could have, or even new supply chains, which could have helped the young entrepreneur and or small business owners. That right now, what I've just described, would have totaled roughly around $15 million. So we still have another $4 million that we could have allocated. And for that additional $4 million, we could have either purchased 30 new or 30 additional electric buses on top of the 30 that have already been purchased, which would have put all of our transportation, public service transportation issues to rest when it comes to getting children to and from school, get people to and from work on a timely basis. But now let's just say, and also that would have put us as to being a world leader for having over 50% of our public transportation system electrified, especially with COP26 being topical. Now, let's just say we didn't want to go with the public buses and we wanted to allocate those funds elsewhere, because the 30 public buses would have cost $4 million. Let's say we didn't put the $4 million there. We could have actually retrofitted a ferry, which would have allowed for more service and taking congestion off our roads, putting it on our water. But then also on top, that would have been $3 million. And for that last $1 million, we could have put on the much needed ferry service to St. George's. That's how it affects the average person.
Thank you. Supplementary or new question?
Actually, Mr. Speaker, all I have to say is wow, and that was a very in-depth answer, and I'm fine with the answer.
Okay,
Mr.
thank
Speaker?
you.
Supplemental, Mr. Speaker.
Supplemental, yes. Opposition leader?
Yes. Can the minister tell us what he would have done with the $300 million that the government has in receivables that the government has not collected?
Mr. Speaker, that is a question for the Minister of Finance.
Hold on. I don't know if that question actually relates to his statement. It may be a valid question, but it has to be related to the statement that was given this morning.
Mr. Speaker, I was just commenting because he indicated what he would do with the money had the money been not collected. And so I'm just saying, along that line, he should also think about the money that was not collected by government. had they collected it, they could have done.
Mr. Speaker, I think he's
He was
rambling
speaking in
on.
reference, he was speaking in reference to the monies that were already allocated, already spent by the ministry for that particular program.
Okay, thank you.
It had a tie, the responses or questions have to tie to that.
Thank you.
I have the supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary, yes, MP Jackson?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good morning. Given the rundown of, that the Minister of Transport has just given us, if we had been able to redirect that money from the minimum, revenue guarantee, how much of that would have gone into the maintenance of our old airport? Because that would, I guess, still stand if we had not proceeded. And we had proceeded with the PLP's $500 million airport, which would have been substantially more money.
Speaker, a point of order, Mr. Speaker.
Be paying in debt.
Hold on. What's your point of order, Minister?
Mr. Speaker, it doesn't appear as if the honorable member is adhering to the rules around parliamentary questions.
Questioning.
And like germane to the statement of the minister. They're talking about things that are not germane. Her question is rather long for one, and not germane to the statement of the minister, which I believe is a primary rule of asking these parliamentary questions or ministerial statement questions.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Minister. I was listening very closely, as I had done with the former member who tried to put a question, and I guided them. And this one, I'm listening very closely, and I'm going to let it continue unless she passes a line that I think we need to pull her back on.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
So, are you finished?
Yes, yep, my supplementary question was, that those were all of the lovely things we could have bought with that money, but I would like to know what expenses we would have had. How much would we have been paying for the old airport that we had in maintenance and the rest? And if we had moved ahead with the $500 million PLP airport, how much?
Mr. Speaker,
Minister, I indicated to you that I'm listening carefully. I understand the rules. Don't interrupt me again, please. Thank you. Member, your question is on the lines of almost speculation as to what would it cost to have run the old facility, what would it cost to have maintained the old facility, etc. What the minister's statement did, the minister's statement gave specifics as to where the dollar could have been spent had they had those dollars in their pocket. He knew not necessarily a speculation, but he knew what it would cost to purchase new buses. He knew what it would cost to do the ferry. He knew what it would cost. Those things that he indicated were real numbers that he could say, if I had that money in my purse deal, I could have bought so many buses. I could have repaired so many ferries. That's the difference between the speculation of what would have been spent on repairing and upkeeping the old airport, not knowing what repairs may have come up. So that's the issue with the wording of your question at this point. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and realizing that there are expenses as well.
Thank you. Minister of Transport, there are questions for you as well from MP Terrell. MP Terrell, would you like to put your question?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and good morning, colleagues. To the Minister, without speculating, if my memory serves me right, the last three-quarter MRG payments were something like 3.9, 7.8, 8.4. How does the Air Service Development Strategy impact future MRG payments?
Understood.
Mr. Speaker, I think the best way to answer that is to just provide a little bit of context before I go into the actual answer.
Try and stick as close as you can to the answer and not throw it out. I think your former minister, your other minister just now when he responded, spoke to us about not trying to keep things lengthy.
No problem. Every person that transverses that airport contributes approximately $100 towards the MRG payment or the regulated revenues. And so when we go to to implement phase 2 of the air service development strategy, that would see Bermuda entering a region that has roughly 44 million individuals that reside there, with a market share that we have identified as 135,000 people. If we were to now be able to get, in the best case scenario, 100% of that market share, that would generate roughly $13.5 million in additional revenue for the country, taking us outside of that MRG threshold. And even if we were to get a quarter of that, that would be $3.3 million, which may not take us outside of the threshold for arrivals, but it would reduce the payment significantly by 75 to 80%.
Supplementary?
Mr. Speaker, supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Yes.
Can the minister elaborate on that market share that he just mentioned?
Yes, I can. So when we talk about the market share, that would be going down to, that's entering a new market. Just like we entered a new market with the phase 1 of the air service development strategy, which took us to, or saw us entering the Azores market with Azores Air, who have seen that to be successful. They will be back in December and then back again next year for the summer. We are looking to replicate that success, build on that success, and enter a market to the south. We're looking to enter the Caribbean market, which could see us making not just travel better for Bermudians, which means that part of the air service development strategy is serving the underserved. It is also dovetailing into the national tourism strategy, which would see us marketing to more affluent lifestyle holders, otherwise known as jet setters, and having them come to Bermuda and becoming not just a locally driven market, but also a tourism destination. And in the case of COVID, where the airline industry is transitioning from luxury travel to back to consistent demand, it is easier for the government to trace, track, and project local demand or local travel trends than it is for us to trace, track, and project the new luxury destination. So therefore, we are mitigating the risk of any further MRG payments, while also enhancing Bermuda as a tourism destination and helping to diversify our tourism product.
Thank you. Further question?
I have a supplementary.
Supplementary?
Yes. Yes.
Supplementary, go ahead, MP Jackson.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the minister discussing his strategy into various regions, but I'd like to know what efforts are being made to secure routes that locals depend on for medical reasons, to reach out to family, for schooling, etc. What is being done to make sure that the routes that locals depend on are going to be secured, and that we can generate enough of a minimum guarantee revenue contribution from those routes so that the Bermudian community can travel where they need to go?
Understood?
I thank the opposition for that question, because that's exactly what we're doing. I didn't mention Boston, Baltimore for off-seas medical service or medical transportation and consistency, just to pick 2 routes out of the air. And I didn't also talk about Miami or the Caribbean as just hypotheticals. This is what we are looking at as part of the air service development strategy phase 2. And although I don't have we don't have the $15 million that would be necessary to be able to do this year round on a consistent basis, we have a strategy, we have a plan, which we are about to implement over the course of the next year to see just that, to see that we can marry new consistency, new service availability, additional air seat availability with the traditional air seat capacity to make sure that Bermudians get consistent, reliable, and sustainable service year round. That's what we're doing. That's what we're in the process of, and that's what we should be hearing about more over the course of the next political and fiscal year.
Supplementary? New question? No further questions?
Nothing more, Mr. Speaker. Thank you.
MP, Minister, you have questions as well from MP Dunkley. MP Dunkley, would you like to put your question?
All right, good morning, Mr. Speaker, and good morning, colleagues. Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the Honorable Minister's statement in regards to Skyport payments being made. And I would like to ask the question to the Honorable Minister is, if the government was running the airport through COVID, in other words, we did not have a contract with ACON, what would be the comparative cost in required funding to carry the airport through COVID, such as debt costs, operating losses, staff payments, all the general daily operating expenses? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Minister?
I thank the member for that question, because he assumes that there are additional costs. Airports are run based off of service provided, not service that might be provided. So there would not have been any additional costs, and the cost of running the airport is usually taken out of the cost out of the operating revenue that is generated by the service provided. So therefore, we would not be having an MRG to pay. We would not have to provide anybody with additional profits. We would have been able to set our budget based off of the service demands. And as service demand drops, so does operational cost. In this case, under this model, operational costs increase while demand decreased. And so therefore, this is why in previous iterations, under previous setups of Parliament, when the now government was opposition, we lobbied against putting the country in this position. Because if we weren't in this position, we would still have enough revenue to be able to do what we need to do without having it as an expense. This deal that we have entered into, which I say time and time again, we maintain that we will obligate our contractual obligations. We would not have these obligations, and thus we would be better off as a country.
Supplementary?
Yeah, supplementary, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the answer, but I look at it a different way. The government closed the airport for a period of time last year. Can the Honorable Minister please provide any expenses that would have had to be met when the airport is closed? If there were no expenses, Mr. Speaker, would mean that the staff would not get paid.
That is exactly correct. You get paid for the time that you work at an airport, not based off salary. So once again, the only additional expense that would have been there would have been electricity, which would not have resulted to the $2 million a year that we are paying now under this project agreement.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the honourable member does admit that there are expenses. Let me ask a second question, Mr. Speaker.
Which second question?
Mr. Speaker, can the honourable minister please provide to this honourable House the passenger volume in the years 2018, 2019, and 2020 at the airport?
I do not have the specific numbers, and I will undertake to bring them back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I look forward to those, because in those numbers, you will see the answers of why we have expenses for the airport, because the passenger volume has dropped off drastically. So I wait for those answers.
Save that for a question.
I wait for the answer from the honourable member, Mr. Speaker.
Save for a question. Any further question?
Yes, supplementary, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary.
As the Minister of Transport, can the Minister give any comment to any airports who have actually made money or turned a profit through the COVID pandemic?
Sure, Acorn.
Mr. Speaker, just, I beg your indulgence.
Speaker, that didn't sound like the Minister.
Deputy, just slow down a bit, okay? Thank you. Mr. Dunkley, I paused because I was trying to relate your question to the statement that was made by the minister this morning. And the minister's statement was specific to the cost of the guarantee, and it spoke to the guarantee. It didn't speak to the overall of what airports were doing elsewhere. If you had a broad international in it in any way, you may have been able to fit your question in, but it was specific to the guarantee and the impact the guarantee is having on the minister's purse.
Mr. Speaker, of course, I accept your ruling, but I think when you look at the question, the ministerial statement in regard to Skyport.
If you accept, if you accept the speaker's ruling, that's the end of the question.
And I was just giving you the understanding where I'm coming from.
If you can put a new question, you can put a new question.
Just giving you the understanding of where I come
That's
from.
right. Put a new question, or we'll move on to the next person who has a question.
You're the speaker. We can move on. I'm just giving you the background, Mrs.
New question. Okay, no questions.
Mr. Speaker,
The
MP Richardson.
the next member indicated to have a question for the, Opposition Whip, yours was a supplementary?
No, Mr. Speaker, it was a new question for the Transport Minister.
Okay, well, I'm going to move on to the next person right now. The next person is MP Jackson. MP Jackson, do you still want to put the questions you indicated, or are you okay with the supplementaries that you've done?
I will yield to the next question. I'm okay for my supplementaries. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay. MP Opposition Whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With the Honorable Minister, as it relates to his statement, one-page statement, last paragraph, he said there's a new air service development strategy, and he also spoke to it during his responses to my honorable colleagues' questions. If he could specify the date when we expect to see that document being either tabled or published.
Thank you. Minister?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There is no specific date right now. We are now currently talking through and in negotiations with other destinations and going through all of the administrative process and doing due diligence. So as it is ready for public consumption, it will be brought in a ministerial statement, if not more, to the House.
Thank you. Supplementary?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The answers provided by the minister were very specific to current pricing in the air travel market. And given that we don't know when the development strategy will be released, how is the minister going to assure that those numbers that he's just released to the public are accurate?
Minister?
Mr. Speaker, I think it goes without saying that the people that are putting this strategy together are subject matter experts that are not only familiar with the local travel trends, they're familiar with global travel trends, and that means they are familiar with with projections and being able to do risk assessments and due diligence. And that is how we can ensure that everything that is said can be done within and or on budget.
Thank you. Supplementary?
Yes, Mr. Speaker. What is the budget?
Second supplementary. Go ahead.
What is the budget for the air service development strategy?
That will be discussed during the budget debate.
Okay. Any further questions? No further questions? We'll move on. Minister, that was the last question for you on your statement. We move on to the next statement. The next statement where there are questions indicated, the immigration statement, the statement from the Minister of Immigration. Minister, you have a question from MP Pearman. MP, would you like to put your question?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Honorable Minister, to the statement you gave to the House this morning. If you look at page 3 of the written statement at the top, there are 3 bullet points. When you read your statement to the House this morning, you omitted the 3rd bullet point. I wasn't sure if that was merely just an oversight, or if that bullet point should intentionally be struck from your statement.
Minister?
Mr. Speaker, the fee associated with that bullet point is also the fee that was mentioned in the introductory paragraph to that particular portion on page 2 at the bottom, where it says spouses of permanent resident certificate holders under section 31B of the Act is $3,150. So children and spouses were already mentioned. That fee was a duplicate fee. So the bullet point fee is in alignment with the fee that I had verbally mentioned when I read the statement.
Thank you.
Supplementary. So
Supplementary?
do I understand, the minister, that I should just cross out that third bullet point from your statement? It's not intended to be there?
The bullet point doesn't create any additional value. It's still relevant as that was one of the amendments that were actually made, but there was no additional new fee for that particular section.
Thank you. Supplementary, Mr. Speaker?
Second supplementary, yes.
Thank you. Minister, in any event, the point is that the fee is still $3,150, correct?
Correct, and I had mentioned that in my statement.
Grateful, grateful. Mr. Speaker, second statement, second question?
Second question, yeah, to use the supplementaries. Go ahead.
Thank you. Honorable Minister, below that on the same page, you set out a series of steps 1 to 4 that will be taken where someone commences an application for PRC or for the certificates and then they receive it. How long does the minister anticipate it will take from start to finish? If someone was to apply today, they will have their certificate in what number of months or longer, in your view?
Minister?
Generally, it takes the complete processing time, just roughly around 6 months. We try to aim for a time period close to that, but what you will see in the paragraph that follows is that we want to move to digitized process and utilize technology which will speed up the processing time for applications.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Minister.
No further questions? Good. Well, members, that brings us to a close.
Speaker, I'm sorry. I think I'm just a little slow on the chat. MP Richardson, question for the Honorable Minister.
Okay, I'm going back to the chat. You had sent one in. Okay. Opposition Whip, go put your question.
Thank you. Thank the Honorable Minister for his statement. Honorable Minister, you in your statement you spoke about fees and there being fees as it relates to the type of application for such as $10,000 for long-term resident, ordinarily resident for 20 plus years, and also PRC fee of $50,000. Would the Honorable Minister please explain whether or not these fees are refundable where an application fails?
That is correct. Mr. Speaker, where an application has been denied, those fees are refundable.
No supplemental, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. So members, that brings us to a close of the question period for this morning. And we'll now move on to the next item on the order paper, which is the congratulatory and obituary speeches.